Hi David, I was watching your video in which you made your take on what went wrong with Integral and why you didn't want to talk about it anymore. And I was hesitant about doing my own because obviously I have my own perspective and just annoying everybody, including you. I don't see the purpose of it. On the other hand, I feel like it would give me personally some sense of closure with that. Similar to you, I'm not particularly interested in talking about these issues anymore. So maybe those experiences can, at least to my future self, be some form of help to see more clearly the issues that I personally have been struggling with. Yeah, as you can imagine, I have a very different take on this whole issue, and I'm not sure it will help you and your perspective. Um, it will most likely be even triggering because I think a lot of what you're doing is an expression of what I find to be the actually more pathological parts or more pathological ways in which you can do integral. So your distancing from integral is done in a fashion, in a way which I find to be an expression of the worst parts of integral itself. And let me give you concrete examples. It's not personal. It's not about you as a figure exclusively. I think those are structural elements that are so deeply ingrained into integral that I think it actually it swims over and takes over many different people and expresses itself through many different people's way of thinking about around these issues. And maybe let's start with the most triggering one that I can imagine to get over with that. I was asking myself when I was listening to the critique of Jamie Wheel that he was raising, and you shared that as a part of your video. And he was complaining about, integral being filled with people without a backbone who are high on Asperger's or something like that. And he was very dismissive. I mean, the language he was using. And I was asking myself, are you really sure he's not talking about you? Because if I had to ask myself, like, which are the interactions that I found to be most frustrating in the integral space of the people I've communicated with, you're definitely one of the top 10, which I found to be most frustrating. And exactly for that reason that Jamie Will is actually expressing, that the human connection isn't there before you engage with someone on a propositional level and discuss whether something is true or something is false. That I had with you. So it was basically impossible to have a discourse with you on a human level, like just share experiences first before getting to the discussion of the meta-theoretical and what is right and what abstractions are most adequate to actually grasp and capture some certain first-person experiences that have to be there, and particularly some joint experiences that have to be there. And this was the experience with you. I mean, we didn't know each other, and before having any common history with each other, there was a constant jumping to the meta-theoretical level of what is the right interpretation of specific concepts of an integral, and yada, yada, yada. And this is just not how human beings meaningfully can interact with each other. This is just, I'm sorry, this is a very Asperger's way of doing human interaction. The way it usually works is that first you meet people, you gather around specific problems and topics that you want to solve together. And then only step by step do you get into your ideology, and then you can see what parts of your ideology are actually helpful for solving a specific question and what parts you have to change if you want to solve the problem together and actually stick together. But you have to have the human connection first. It doesn't work the other way around. And this is, I think, a structural problem that not only Integral has. I think many movements have had this problem and this challenge, and it shows itself in this extreme tribalization that we can observe, which is not only typical of Integral. I had hoped Integral would do better with it. It didn't. But it's showing itself everywhere, where people are starting upside down. They're starting with top-down conceptualization. They're starting with meta theory first before they actually meet in person. And this feels so weird. Like when I had interactions with you, it was so weird because we were already discussing meta-theoretical questions before I had even had expressed any willingness to do so or any sense of trust towards you as a person that we have enough basic common ground that we can actually go into those topics. And that was something that was observable within the whole community, with the result being tribalization. So the result simply being that people started to fragment the moment they saw that they started disagreeing on certain issues. You couldn't have any meaningful, respectful disagreements anymore. So the dictum that there actually are multiple interpretations suddenly didn't make sense anymore because people were starting out with the propositional first and not with the human connection first, which creates a sense of bonding, a sense of trust, and the sense of being in this whole thing together. This wasn't there anymore. People started fighting over even the smallest conceptual differences because everything integral from a certain point on actually became, to many of us, was a certain kind of discourse, a certain kind of language game where the distinctions made a difference and made basically all the difference there could be. And there was nothing else. There was nothing else which could complement the whole thing. Integral became exclusively a map. The map itself became the practice. So the distinction between the map not being the territory became meaningless, right? The point that integral theory started out with the distinction, I think you took this from Julian Jaynes, the distinction between the map and the territory didn't make sense anymore because people were exclusively moving within the map and discussing who has the map right. And this ideological bent of the whole thing, I think, became obvious to many, many people. Integral lost so many people who were extremely gifted, extremely devoted to the whole thing because they felt like, well, this is obviously ideological. And when something gets ideological, it simply gets boring. This is something you could notice when you spend like more than 1 year in the whole movement. You actually felt like, well, okay, the stuff starts to get repetitive. You start to get a grasp over the basic concepts. And you see that it's nothing but the discussion of the concepts. There is no juice in the whole thing. It's just a mere framework, and there is absolutely no flesh. There is nothing to experience there. You can't learn science through Integral. You can't learn sociology through Integral. Most people wouldn't even do the homework of reading Habermas, for example, something that you could do alone, let alone doing real research in the area. So you couldn't do any of the things that supposedly were the territory. You couldn't do within Integral. You could only discuss the code itself. This got so boring that I think Integral was outcompeted by other movements which were far less comprehensible, which were far less integrative in their outreach, which didn't really have as solid a meta theory, but they had much more juice. Like, for example, Jordan Peterson. What you can like, dislike him, and he's gotten really weird. His brain has basically been fried in the past few years, but still, if you listen to his podcasts, his lectures were just more interesting than most of the stuff that was going on within Integral, simply because they had juice. You could learn something about psychology. You could learn something about history, very contrary to what was happening in most Integral spaces, where you had a constant repetition of the same concepts. And if I look at your content, I inadvertently just see the same pattern reappearing, this over-focus on the meta level, on the level of abstractions, at the price of not really living up to actual data and coming up with concrete new research that is actually happening, concrete historical knowledge, sociological knowledge, cultural knowledge, all the different dimensions of practice that supposedly Integral theory was to bring together and hold together are just not there. It becomes just a mere language game and boring, and many people left for good reason. And the other thing that happens when you exclusively become an ideology, right, and when you focus exclusively on the conceptual and propositional, is that you lose out of sight exactly the sphere that, who was it? I think Layman Pascal was complaining about, right? That people are really missing this middle layer of the normal human interactions that's not there. And just look at the kind of complaints that you have against Wilber, that he's not responding to his critics. Well, that's good and nice, but you're missing the human perspective that Wilber has been basically not there for 20 years. He has literally been dead for 20 years. And this is something that people can tell you who have been in his close circles and who know him before his, was it strokes or seizures, whatever. He's a different person now. And he's not available to those persons either. He's not available to his critics. He has never been. But he's not available to those people who admire him either. As Zach Stein at one point put it, people just don't realize that the king has been wounded and how badly the king has been wounded. People don't realize that he's actually in a difficult situation. And particularly people who have gone through cognitive decline. Vlad Wexler is really good on this, who is describing his own cognitive decline and how it feels from within. I think it's difficult for them to imagine what happens to someone who's particularly defining themselves in their own identity through their intelligence, through their ability to be actively and fastly capable of responding to outside stimuli. When you lose that ability, what happens to you as a person and what happens to you as a spirit? I mean, Wilber is still there as a spirit. I think he senses the depth of certain problems and certain issues, but I think he has a very difficult time of getting into the public and defending any position whatsoever. I mean, he has a difficult time even understanding what the other person is saying. I mean, just to give you one example, if someone tells you, like he did, like 1 or 2 years ago in an interview, that he can't wait for this body to die so that he can, get rid of all the suffering and get into the next world, that's not very consistent with the Wilber that you usually know from his books. So I think this would tell you on a purely human level how that person might be feeling, what that person might be experiencing, to have such a degree of willingness to actually let go of the bodily experience of being here and present in this world, how much suffering you have to go through to actually say that and express that position. I think it's very difficult to imagine, but it's there. This is the human level that I don't hear you speak about. And this is the reality of it. The reality of it is that Wilber hasn't been there for 20 years. Before he went away, he tried to actually engage with his critics. He actually was reading his critics more than many others have been reading him. But after that, he hasn't been there available, neither for his critics nor for his biggest fans. I mean, I know from people who want to be close with him and have kind of close relationships to him that he just doesn't respond. He's gone. And, the dictum with you kind of have to kill the Buddha, well, the same thing is happening here with Wilber, and he's making it easier for us because he kind of isn't there anymore. And yet what I hear from you is the complaint, Wilber didn't say that, he didn't respond to this, he didn't take this seriously. This is totally missing the normal interhuman level of realizing, hey, where is Wilber at? What is happening to Wilber, the human being? And it's ridiculous. I'm really sorry, but this is like you have to have spent your entire life basically just reading online posts and not have had a human connection to miss that part. It's absolutely mind-boggling to me. To give another example, is like when he was speaking about after when his wife died of cancer, how great spirits cause great thunderstorms, and there was a thunderstorm in the area, something like that. I mean, people have really lost the connection with the whole thing. Would start discussing over how Wilber is actually superstitious and how his whole theory is wrong and flawed because he believes in supernatural phenomena and stuff like that. And Wilber, people discussing that are just missing, I'm sorry, they're missing the obvious human point that that's a human being that is grieving, that is actually in a state of shock and in a state of suffering. And cognitive decline with him, for example, is obvious after his strokes or seizures, or whatever they were. But cognitive decline is also there if you are in a state of grieving, if you are in a severe state of suffering. And to miss that point, to not see that, hey, he's actually doing you a favor here by simply expressing what's happening to him as a spirit when he's going through grief. Instead of seeing that grief as being part of the whole thing, people focus on the content of, what specifically did he say? What was the actual content? He must be so stupid because, how can the death of a certain person cause a thunderstorm and stuff like that? I'm sorry, but this is just, again, it's mind-boggling. I mean, you really have to be high on Asperger's to not see the human aspect of this whole thing and have this very weird relationship to Wilber as a person, because you don't meet him as a person, but you meet him, the critics and the fans alike are meeting him like a superhuman ideal that nobody can actually live up to and doesn't meet his humanity. And it's more expressive of the people themselves and what those people want Wilber to be as a person than it is of either his positions, or it is an example of a healthy form of human interaction. It's an impossible form of human interaction that people are, I think, demanding here. And this obsession over images and this obsession over concepts, over the right theory, again, theory of everything, I think was obvious. It was a pun, it was a joke. There can't be a theory of everything. This obsession over ideology expresses itself in the inability to admit uncertainty. So ironically, again, look at all the critics, including you, who've been complaining, Wilber is so certain about those things, he never expresses uncertainty. Well, have you ever expressed uncertainty about anything? I can't seriously remember any of your content, in particular your online interactions, where people who are obviously more open to being wrong than you are, you can't even engage with those people in a meaningful way and see that they're actually making an offering to you. Because you have to be right. You have to be right. I mean, I'm really sorry, but when you train an AI to tell you that your theory is the best theory ever. This is really like a bad joke. It really is like it is like playing with the worst aspects of integral theory itself. And if I didn't know that you are actually a different person from Wilber, I could have actually imagined that Wilber created you as an avatar to make fun of himself or the worst aspects of integral theory. I mean, how weird is that? Compared to Wilber always being right about everything, creating your own AI which tells you in front of an audience that you're the best. I think this is several degrees more cringe. I'm really sorry. Unless you did it consciously and did it as a self-irony thing and to tell people something about the bad aspects of integral and how it can become ideological and how it can become possessed by those images of being right and by those propositional shackles. Unless you did that, I think it's just, I'm sorry, mate, it's just obvious to everybody who's watching this is just cringe and weird. Yeah, and once thinking has become so ideological, it is not only self-possessed and self-absorbed anymore, it just becomes less pluralistic in the sense that you don't have many people who want to participate in such a thing who are truly diverse and different from each other. Well, if you flip it, if you ask a question, well, what was the purpose of integral theory initially, aside of being a joke? The purpose of integral theory initially was that the real world problem that Wilber was facing was that he was in contact with people from different traditions whom he all admired, as he expressed. He had deep admiration for people who were coming from very, very different worldviews. And what was bugging him that he couldn't get those people into a room and make them communicate with each other because they would basically treat each other as enemies. And what he tried to create with integral theory was a code that those people could share with each other, which would help all of those people to communicate with each other. So this was the measure by which you could figure out whether integral theory is right or wrong on a specific issue. The measure is not a kind of empiricist. Well, but does it match the data? Is it correct? Does it match our empirical knowledge about things? This was never the measure. The measure for Wilber from the start was, can it include different discourses that are already out there and that are already established and have a point, and they're already existing worldviews? Can it create a language through which those worldviews can actually meaningfully get together at the table and learn something from each other? This was the measure for whether integral was successful or not. And observe how this measure is not existing for you either. The measure is gone the moment you have pure ideology, and the moment the theory itself becomes the territory, the map becomes the territory, you lose that measure. You can have a measure like, well, is it consistent? Is it coherent? But it loses the major important point, which is how do you figure out whether it's right or wrong? With integral, again, the initial conception of integral was easy. If you exclude one big tradition from the picture, you by definition are wrong. You have a bad integral theory, whatever version of integral theory you have. And in this vein, Wilber was insisting that you need to have different variants and different versions of integral theories, and you have to have different codes, you have to have different language games and versions of integral theories, because there can't be just one single code which is accessible to all people and all traditions in all times. You need to have different variations of integral theories which are locally applicable in certain contexts. This is totally missing. This idea that there is actually a link between the meta theory and the different practices is totally missing in most critics who are complaining about Wilber. Like when you ask yourself, but has it ever been their norm? Has it ever been their expectation to actually bring different discourses together? They avoid the problem by simply defining an entire community of people as stupid or as being pre-rational or whatever else. So you never face the problem if you define something away, if you define the problem away. But then you just simply face the reality that whatever you have to offer people is obviously ideological. And it's something where people obviously can't really feel like they're developing, like they're learning, and they can, with the knowledge that they're gaining, participate in society. And that's something that I've been observing in Wilber, that many people had actually to make the choice. Do you want to participate in society, normal day society, or do you want to be part of this special society, which is talking about integral all the time? And many people had to make the choice. And many people who were extremely gifted and extremely creative actually chose to go back to normal society, which they felt was more pluralistic and was more interesting and something you could learn more from than the integral communities, the different versions and aspects of it, which more and more became so predictive and so boring and so focused around the same concepts. And all of this so far might be sounding like I'm totally avoiding all the points that you're making, and I'm sure it's frustrating the hell out of you. Um, and I get that, but what I want to communicate is that I think that those presumptions are more important than the propositional content itself, which people then can discuss around. Like, what is the purpose of an integral theory for you? Why are you doing this? Why do you think it should make a difference to you, or it should make a difference to other people? What is the measure by which you will know, oh, I did something wrong, I need to adapt my theory? What's the purpose of this whole thing? And I just think we disagree already on this level, because I just have a very different understanding of what a solid integral theory actually should be about, and respectively, how it would express itself in the world. For me, it wouldn't express itself as the one or best theory or best narrative out there. I mean, this is a path that so many people have taken up and they have failed. Like metamodernism as well. Many elements of metamodernism actually suggested, oh, we have the better narrative than integral has, right? And once we fix the narrative, once we have that figured out and gotten rid of all the metaphysical garbage that's in there and all the metaphysical assumptions that have not been reflected on, things will come together. Well, what happened? They basically suffered the same fate as integral did, because they were not focusing, again, on the stuff that Lehmann Pascal was pointing out, on the human stuff. And they were not focusing on the territory itself. And they were like weird, over abstracted, heady conceptions that for many people just don't really have a purpose, except for allowing other people to discuss them and having a constant topic of debate. But they lose their life world connection, and they suffer from the same problems and challenges as integral theory did back in the day. And exactly the same thing is happening in those communities as well. And exactly the same thing I would predict would happen in your community if we were successful to create one. People would start to obsess over minor differences around issues, and they would still fragment, and they would still tribalize, and still be incapable of talking meaningfully to each other, still be incapable of holding a relative diversity together. People would still become more and more narrowed down. You would have more and more of the same type of people in the group, which again is, once you see that and you experience that and you're really honest about that, it's very cult-like, and it gives you a sense of security and belonging and stuff, but it's so boring. It's just so thin soup. And that's what I had in mind when I did, like a few years ago, when I did this video from the truck, and I shared it with you. When I had in mind that I didn't want to go into the ideas of Jordan Peterson, I didn't want to go into specific persons and focus on what they specifically mean about something, but raise foundational questions themselves and think together about those foundational questions. The point that I actually wanted to make, and part of it maybe got realized by you. So when you mentioned that, oh, it's good that I'm doing this kind of job, so I'm a truck driver, and look at how unfair society is because some people have to be truck drivers. It was at least going into the direction which I actually initially intended. The direction was not exactly to complain about my own society and how my own society made me a truck driver. It was actually the opposite. I mean, I grew up in Austria, which is one of the top 5 most social countries around. So I don't think the States will be anywhere close to the social system which is available in Austria today, even in 100 years from now. So I don't think you can have a much fairer society than Austria has. It was truck driving was a choice that I made based on prior experiences in my own path. But indeed, there was a point to it that I was doing it from the truck. The thing that I wanted to express, and I didn't speak about in those videos back in the day, what I wanted to express was, hey, look, this is the first time in human history where people who are isolated from each other, coming from entirely different world spaces, and this is something that I believe the truck driving was representing. When you're a truck driver, when you've been among truck drivers, the first thing you will notice, they are different. They come from a different worldview. So all the things that make you a good thinker, that you make you good within, for example, an academic setting, all of the norms that are important there and they're valid within this setting make you a bad truck driver. Just one trivial example that I've been given, to properly secure the load on your truck, you would actually have to use 2 belts per row, and you have, I think, 11 or 12 rows, and you have to use special floor mats for the load to be properly secured. And this is according to the laws of physics, right? So when you brake with your truck, the load doesn't actually start moving and kill somebody. Now, the reality of it is that most truck drivers don't do this. Most truck drivers use at best 1 belt, if they use any belt at all, and they don't use those underfloor mats, without which, by the way, you couldn't possibly secure the load so that it would meet the criteria for security. So the reality of it is that most truck drivers are moving with a load which is not properly, according to physical laws, secure. They're doing something that's bad, something that's illegal. From an academic standpoint, that's evil, right? So you're kind of not just doing something, you're doing something that is amoral. From an academic standpoint, not only are you doing that and endangering other people, but you're polluting the environment, you are submitting to people who are extracting you and blah, blah, blah. So you couldn't be a progressive academic and a truck driver at the same time. You have to change. You have to change your worldview. You have to change the way you think about reality. You have to change your goals if you want to be successful at the job. So for me, truck driving is not just truck driving. It represents a different worldview. It represents a really different world space. And what I wanted to show with that video is for the first time of human history, that those isolated different world spaces can come together and have a meaningful exchange with each other. That was the point of my video. The point was not to prove you wrong about Peterson or prove you right or discuss the actual content, the actual ideas of what is the right way of framing of how we should think about Peterson. This was not what I was interested in. What I was interested in is that for the first time in human history, you can try to have a meaningful exchange between those world spaces that are usually divided and they're usually not capable of talking for each other. That's the integral endeavor. The integral endeavor, from the start, the entire integral project has been attempting to bring together different world spaces and figure out ways of how can we make those communicate and learn from each other. And obviously that point got lost, right, in the whole debate, because obviously you guys jumped into defending yourself and discussing, right? And this just wasn't interesting to me at all. What I was much more interested in asking the question is like, how can you create a structure which would incentivize actual communication between these different world spaces and make it actually possible? Because we know that the traditional way of communicating is not working. If it was working, if with these kind of interactions that we have now in social media, if it was working, we would have people being capable of understanding each other more, and we would have a strengthened sense of solidarity with people who disagree with you are not coming from your own world space. But we see the opposite happening. We see people fragmenting into silos and becoming more and more divided. So that was what I was initially interested in, the very foundational question of how do you do that? How do you bring people meaningfully together and constructively bring people together? Not to discuss the best interpretation of what you should think a specific concept in a meta theory should actually mean so that it's right or it's the best version of it. That's ridiculous. This has nothing to do with an integral endeavor as far as I'm concerned. I think it's a very different interpretation of what meta theories actually or should actually be about, which was not itself thematized. And I just saw that there's no point in talking about these issues because there is such a wide disagreement on what integral theory actually is supposed to mean. On the pre-reflective level, or if you want, the pre-scientific level, we have already so big and vast disagreements that I don't think there is any way possible we could have meaningful, fruitful discussions about the abstract concepts themselves. Because the framing itself of what the theory is supposed to do is already so different in how we approach the whole thing and what we think the purpose of integral theory is in the first place. Yeah, and to annoy you even more and maybe bring this to a close, let me mention that Wilber was right about everything. This must be very, very painful, particularly for the critics, to watch. What was the biggest points that people raised against Wilber that are just out there? If you just go through the criticism and look for good stuff and are hopeful for good stuff, except for Johannes Heinrichs, who had a really good critique, but nobody has, I think, read that critique. Most of the other stuff was focusing around the notion of idealism. That's one point. and the notion of eros. That's the second point. And I think for most critics it must be very painful that those circles that still are existing today and have some kind of relation to Integral. And it's really interesting to observe because in a sense Integral failed as a single movement. So in a sense of having people who would self-identify as being Integral. That's true. I can't remember who said that. You shared that critique from someone. That's true, but on the other hand, if you look at all the interesting circles that are out there, including the different metamodern spaces, if you look, a huge percentage of the people who are there who have gone through some form of integralism and have at least read Wilber, and have been inspired by integral theory to some degree or other. And what can you observe in those circles, even in circles that are kind of distant from integral, like the stuff that Jim Rutt, for example, is doing? What are the concepts that are ever more becoming relevant in the past few years and getting stronger and stronger defenses? Well, it's precisely reasonable versions and reasonable notions of idealism, like the stuff that Bernardo Kastrup has, for example, put out there. I wouldn't agree with everything, obviously, but I think it has some valid elements and valid points that people coming from the integral communities could have made before that, right? They could have made certain aspects of reasonable defenses of idealism. So in this sense, I kind of can agree with Wilber that, okay, if Wilber couldn't do those things and defend idealism against his critics, because again, he wasn't there for his fans either, he was just gone for 20 years, then why didn't the community do it? Like, why didn't the people, where are the people, the Kastrups from within the community? It's kind of disappointing, right? Integral didn't really bring forth those thinkers who would come up with reasonable defenses and who have reasonably well studied those traditions to actually give a meaningful defense of them. Integral couldn't pull this off, right? Integral didn't really achieve that, but those thinkers came from other circles. And one of the concepts that is also pretty much becoming more and more en vogue, ironically, again, today, is eros. I think those are the two single most significantly to have grown concepts in the past few years in those entire circles, as diverse as they might be. The concept of idealism, or reasonable forms of idealism, and the concept of eros is getting a huge revival, and it's different from as different people as from, for example, Johannes Jäger, who I don't think has any connections to integral whatsoever. I'm not sure about that, but he definitely is a very different thinker from Michael Levin, for example, who has been also popular in those circles, and both have specific versions of eros and reintroducing specific versions of eros that are not as crazy as all the stuff that the critics have been complaining about. So you might say, well, Wilber knew nothing of that, and he had just a weird version of idealism and just a weird version of eros and was not aware of the literature at all. But it's obvious that most of these people who are defending these concepts today, and who are not necessarily coming from the integral tradition itself, and have relatively solid positions, or at least they are reasonable enough to be, a viable other, someone who is someone you can constructively disagree on these issues. They're not just crazy and pre-rational, as many people would put it. Even those people, I lost my thought here. Yeah, I've still lost my thought, but I think the direction in which I wanted to go was that, these people could have come from integral circles if Integral had done a good job. If Integral had done a good job, it would have brought forth people who are adequately informed in those different traditions and could defend them and give them a not so crazy defense. But they didn't come from Integral. Those people came from other communities, and oftentimes came from themselves by just being passionate about those topics and being passionate about those perspectives. But this is equally true of the critics of Integral. If you look at those, they couldn't come up with a reasonable version of idealism to actually defend. And you can disagree with Bernardo. He has, on certain issues, he has weird views, but he also has reasonable positions and solid positions. And if you were to one-to-one argue and interact with Bernardo, I actually even fear that you would lose. Purely intellectually, I fear that you wouldn't stand a chance against him. Same thing with Johannes Jäger, who I don't think would even want to be connected to the movement at all. So it's kind of double disappointing, right? Because you would hope the critics would get this right and they would at least get a better version of idealism to then debunk and then prove wrong. But it turned out the critics were even worse than Wilber and his intuitions on these matters, because at least he had read the literature. And I think this was the initial point I wanted to make, that at least Wilber had read the same sources as some of the defenders today are actually, who are capable of intellectually standing up and making a point for those traditions. At least Wilber had read and a sense for those traditions, so he could have a sane intuition of where this whole thing would be going. And of course, obviously, the other big topic on which Wilber was right about was wokeism as a movement. He had been seeing those phenomena and predicted those like 2 decades ago, that were more and more taking over academia. And the lack of that recognition, and the lack of the recognition of how problematic this form of ideology actually is, and how harmful to the reputation of the humanities as a whole, the lack of that recognition was co-responsible for the rise, for the rise of modern day authoritarianism. It fed it. It gave it really easy prey, because it could really easily show how certain views are just absurd and outright bonkers. And if within your own community you don't pay attention to that, and single those out and make sure that it's not something that represents your movement as a whole, then you actually can be beaten by clowns, as it happened. So I'm sorry, but on these issues, Wilber was right, and these are some of the most culturally and foundationally issues that are out there. He was actually more right than his critics. And now to bring this to a close, and maybe in a more constructive way, because so far I've been just complaining and bashing stuff. So I just so far told you why I don't think an interaction on these issues for me is relevant at all, because I don't think that it frames an integral theory, whatever version of an integral theory, as being anything that resembles something that I would find to be valuable, or something that I would find to be a worthy engagement. Like I already expressed that for me, an integral theory has the purpose of creating a meta code that many people can use, coming from different specific traditions, to then become able to learn from each other and to communicate from each other, with each other in constructive ways, and learn from each other. And I don't see this happening. I don't see this happening in Integral today, and I don't see this happening with whatever you are doing. I think it is very similar actually to the more pathological aspects of Integral, by just becoming its own cult and becoming its own ideology. So I don't think an engagement on the propositional level and asking the specific questions about levels, lines, stages, and all this stuff, I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever, because the whole thing from the start for me is doomed to be a cult, and not something that helps people reintegrate into society and feel like a part of a whole global and world society, which for me is the main thing. It's the main job of any kind of integral theory. To just give one more really pathological example, there was this really weird cult in Germany, which supposedly was connected to Integral. I mean, the connection to Integral was that one of the founders had read some Wilber. But what it did, it was basically to take in different people and take all their belongings, and override it to a small hierarchy of people who were supposedly the more evolved people, and therefore deserved all those means at their full disposal, right? And this is like one of the worst versions of, I wouldn't call it Integral, but interpretations of Integral that you can have. So in other words, instead of people coming to you and you helping people to reintegrate into society, in broader society, so figuring out themselves to a level enough, and figuring out their own cognitive biases to a level enough so they can drop them and be capable to reintegrate into society and learn in society. Because this is I think this is the most obvious challenge for most of us, that we are so possessed by either our personal sufferings and our personal traumas and our personal cognitive biases, that we are incapable to dock into society, to connect with overall society and be productive members of society. So instead of doing that, instead of helping people to come here, expand your mind, expand your linguistic vocabulary, and then be able to go back into society and suddenly see how things start making sense to you, and how all the practices that are available have something to offer for you, and it doesn't always have to be exactly the thing that you expect to be offered to you, so that you can suddenly start studying things that you found to be, oh, it's just boring, it has nothing to do with me, it has no connection with me. Instead of doing that, instead of bringing people back into society, what this small cult was doing, it was extracting even the material means from people. It was making them subservient to a very small hierarchy of people. And the basic lesson was, hey, we don't want to make those people adaptable, and we don't want to reintegrate them into society again. We want them to be here in this circle, independent on us, even to the degree that, hey, they have to give us their belongings, and they have to make themselves literally available to us as mere means. That's like the worst possible imaginable version of Integral. And unfortunately, many of the other versions that are out there are just, a little more sane versions of that. But I don't see many examples of Integral of being exactly that kind of what Wilber, for example, envisioned with the Integral University and the Integral Multiplex, where people from different backgrounds come together to have their minds expanded so that they can actually understand and they can actually feel a connection to traditions that just felt foreign and stupid and in some cases even evil to you, right? This is typical. When you come from one tradition, you experience everybody else as, well, not only stupid, but evil to a certain degree. And I think the ideal version of an Integral multiplex would have been to actually be the place where you drop your ideology. You learn to undo your ideology so that you can become open to learn. Or as to use the metaphor from the Matrix, like the major driving force for the whole movie to actually make sense is that you have this magic machine which allows it to you to learn very fast, very different traditions. We don't have that. This doesn't exist in our present day culture. Learning is a very tedious, very slow process, and usually it's highly ideological. So it limits you to one specific tradition and doesn't allow you to see outside of that tradition. We don't have this magic device, which is the crucial device in the Matrix, which makes you superhuman, which helps you to get, to get outside of your own prejudice and your own worldview. And to close in a more constructive manner. So my interest has always been how to avoid those extreme forms of cult-like bubbles, which do the opposite of integration, and how to structurally create ways of interactions where people can learn from each other, even coming from different traditions. And this is just simply rooted in my own experience of having grown between different cultures. I was raised multicultural and firsthand experienced how difficult it is to actually do multiculturalism well, because just sharing the same space with other people is not enough. It's just not going to make the significant changes that are necessary in your mind, in your condition, in your cognition, to be actually capable of understanding the other side. It's very easy to be locked in the same room with other people, but it's very, very difficult to understand those other people and to get in meaningful interactions with those people. And my personal focus has been on how social annotation or the structure of the medium itself can be changed, so that the interactions that we have are more constructive and help us understand each other and help us learn from each other, even though the proximity isn't there from the start. So you start out with people who feel relatively foreign to each other, who might even feel like enemies to each other, and then stepwise, through going through the traditional process of understanding or hermeneutics, through going through the process without necessarily even noticing that, because it's built into the medium through annotation, how they can actually get closer to each other. And I think it should have, if we've gotten so far, it should have become obvious that most of what has been happening in integral circles and most of what I've seen you doing is exactly the opposite. Instead of helping people to come together starting from relatively diverse positions, it seems like almost the opposite is the case. People who are relatively similar, right? Take, for example, John Vervaeke and Sam Harris. They have certain disagreements on certain issues, and John Vervaeke has been complaining about Sam Harris and how bad he is. But the reality of it is they agree on, I think, 80 to even 90% of their worldviews. So they're relatively similar to each other. And yet they experience themselves as being more different from each other than the actual people who are out there. I can guarantee you that there are people out there who John Vervaeke would defend who are so radically more different than Sam Harris and so different from him as a person and don't share most of his presuppositions, that it's really surprising that he chooses one of the persons that is closest to his worldview ever to criticize and to complain about. And I see something very similar happening in the integral circles. People who are already relatively similar to each other become even more different by starting to fight over specific propositional meanings. And this is, again, there's a process that I'm not interested in. And I don't think you solve it by engaging in the propositional discussions themselves. I lack the cognition, certainly, but I also think it's the wrong overall project. It's just a project I'm not interested in. And what I've written out is in more long text form is how like you can use new media to actually connect people and create integral without really using necessarily integral language, without necessarily using these integral meta theories and frameworks, by creating the channels of communication between people, which induce the communication part. And once you have the communication part, whatever theories come out, whatever abstractions are the result of that, are to a certain degree already integral, because they are the result of a multiplicity of life forms finding together and figuring out reality, right? This is my approach, the bottom-up approach, which is bring the people together who are cognizant on specific issues, who already have a worldview, who already, as Jamie Wheals puts it, have a backbone and have a certain position. It's not a coincidence that Jamie Wheals was, I think, making the reference to blue. People who already have a worldview, come from a specific world space and experience, who have already disciplined their thinking and have learned in a certain area, and then bring those people together with others and help them get into meaningful interactions. That, for me, is a meaningful integral theory, and that is a measurably meaningful integral theory where you can point out, hey, this is something that works, obviously, and this is something that doesn't work because the people are just not capable of getting to each other. And that's something that has social value as well. It's something that actually helps us bring societies into coherence that so far are just fragmenting it into bits and pieces. And this fragmentation, just imagine it, wouldn't be stopped even if people started believing in a very specific version and interpretation of integral, which might be yours. It wouldn't change what's happening on the ground. People would still become more and more polarized. And with this, I just want to close. Like, I think this is the general misunderstanding of what I think we believe integral theories are there for, what their purpose is, and what they're doing. And this misunderstanding can happen and arises because Wilber is not specifically speaking about this. He's doing this. Integral theory is the result of his being confronted with certain challenges in life and trying to overcome those specific challenges. But he's not speaking about those challenges themselves. He is not thematizing them. He is not reflecting on them. And the result is that many people are picking out integral theory to have a very, very different purpose from the start. And if your purpose is to be right about reality, that's not the purpose that integral theory had from the start, and that's just not the purpose that I'm interested in.